So, Japan just had an election. Here's what you need to know. The governing coalition of the Liberal Democratic Party and Komeito just lost the majority in Japan's House of Representatives, and for the first time since 2009, the LDP cannot govern in its own right. Now comes a time of massive political uncertainty in Japan and uncertainty over the fate of the country itself. Though, let's turn back time to see how we got to this point in the first place. It wasn't even a month ago where Japan had a different prime minister who was incredibly unpopular due to a number of scandals. One big scandal included the purging of multiple members of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's faction due to their associations with the Unification Church cult, and Kishida's popularity never really quite survived from that because of this cult's connections with the LDP. Not to mention the fact that Japanese society is incredibly sensitive towards the notions of religious groups pushing and infiltrating certain ideas within their polity. A larger scandal, also involving members of the Abe faction, was the slush fund scandal, which has lasted for the past 2 years. It was found that the faction failed to report like 600 million yen in campaign funds, which were misused by members of that faction. This did not help Kishida's already faltering approval rating, despite him taking decisive action against the Abe faction and the general public's perception of the LDP in general. Not to mention the fact that Kishida also presided over the passage of the LGBT Understanding Promotion Act last year, which aimed to prevent what the legislation called unfair discrimination of LGBT folks, but was massively criticized because it could be the start of a slippery slope where Japan could eventually legalize same-sex marriage, which would be absolutely disastrous to the social fabric of Japanese society, as we have already seen in the West. It was also the passage of this law that resulted in the formation of the Conservative Party of Japan, which is headed by this staunch conservative television producer who is also quite personally popular. The CPJ will become a bit more relevant a bit later. After we've heard about all of these scandals the LDP were involved in, why are they supposed to be the good guys? Simple answer is that any party is of course imperfect, and when a party like the LDP that is supposed to be conservative, when that big institution fails and stops being conservative, then during an election, that party should be punished with a protest vote to a party that actually cares about conservative values, like the CPJ or Sanseito. However, I am still a big believer in institutions. Like here in Australia, there's the Liberal Party. In the UK, it's the Conservatives. In the US, it's the Republicans. And if institutions as big as these centre-right parties are able to be reformed, then it is in that yes, the LDP has had failures, but there are people like Sanae Takaichi and Taro Aso on the right of the party who are also able to make, if they're actually able to make change, I should say, we as voters should be able to fully support and be fully supportive of those people who actually want reform in these institutions wherever we are in the world. Not to mention that we're talking about the LDP here, which the only two issues that you guys will probably care about are immigration and issues regarding the alphabet cult. And the LDP are the only party that is quite clear in capping immigration to Japan and opposing the legislation of same-sex marriage. And if they're literally the only big party that is going to do that, then I wouldn't see why we shouldn't be supportive of the LDP despite its failures. I can also mention defense, foreign policy, and nuclear, where the LDP takes China and North Korea as very serious threats to the point where they're pushing for Japanese remilitarization, which does benefit the US too, because Japan won't have to rely on America for its self-defense. On nuclear, the LDP is also still keen on keeping nuclear energy around too. But at this point, I will pause for a moment to thank Arin Yumi for his commentary on the Japanese election, because he's the only reliable English source I depend on, and he deserves way more followers than he already has now. So do go follow him on Twitter, link in the description. Regardless, it was only a matter of time before Kishida resigned, and he did just that, and the LDP leadership election kicked off last month, where there were 9 candidates in total running for the job. But the two who are relevant to this video were the moderate Shigeru Ishiba and the staunch conservative Sanae Takaichi, who has previously been described as Shinzo Abe's protege. Ishiba won in the runoff election by a sliver of a margin, and if we look at the polling, the LDP actually initially recovered in their popularity popularity, but after Ishiba backtracked on a few of his campaign promises, including a proposal for an Asian NATO, LDP polling further plummeted, and of course it was at this moment that the newly sworn Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba thought it was a fantastic idea to waltz straight into an election. So with that came an election campaign which could only be characterized from my perspective as something that didn't really have a lot of energy behind it, because on one hand Japan's under new leadership, but on the other this is the same LDP that's responsible for all of those scandals, and not to mention that Ishiba himself doesn't have much charisma around him. So just from my observations, it did feel very lethargic, but there was definitely a sense among the Japanese electorate that they did want political reform because of LDP corruption, and a lot of people weren't really voting for the opposition parties because they actually agree with them and their policies. Rather, they were voting for the opposition as an anti-LDP vote. Then comes election day and we start getting the first results in, and it's already looking bad for the LDP early in the evening. A JNN exit poll puts the LDP and its coalition partner, Komeito, well below the 233 seats needed for a majority in parliament. What's starting to become apparent is that the Abe faction is absolutely being slaughtered, with multiple members losing their seats. This picture is from the LDP's supposed victory party, with Shinjiro Koizumi pictured alone and surrounded by the press. This is the look on Ishiba's face when he arrives at LDP HQ, and apparently he is quoted by TV Asahi as having said, "It is what it is." Now, there is partial good news, because two right-wing parties, Sanseito and the Conservative Party, have both established a foothold in the House of Representatives, and the Communist Party severely underperformed from their own expectations. In terms of the other parties, the center-left Constitutional Democratic Party performed well, especially in Hokkaido. Center-right Isshin no Kai maintained its stronghold in Osaka, but due to internal disagreements within the party whether they would work with the LDP and a coalition, meant their performance was limited. The center-right Democratic Party for the People also doubled its seat count, and far-left Reiwa also improved on their previous seat count. The LDP's coalition partner Komeito is not unscathed by the election, with their leader having lost their seat, and to add fuel to the fire, has apparently not ruled out defecting to join the opposition in a grand coalition. Which brings us to what could happen next after this incredible election result. There are three possibilities for the sort of government that could form, and those are an LDP-led coalition with Komeito and one of the center-right parties, including Isshin or the DPP. Ideologically, Isshin and the DPP are a lot closer to the LDP because they are both generally dispositionally conservative, but have differences in economic policy and other very specific issues that they care about. However, both parties have supposedly ruled out working in a coalition with the LDP, which means this coalition is possible and more workable than the alternatives I'm about to outline. But as I said, this election had a lot of Japanese people vote against the LDP, and those other two parties may not want to betray that vote. Which brings me to an anti-LDP grand coalition led most likely by the CDP. However, while they may all be united by the fact that they're all anti-LDP, there's not really much ideological cohesion between each of these parties. So let me lay out Japan's political parties on a spectrum, and these are the parties that will be part of this possible coalition. And I'm sure you can already see the problem here. You're expecting radical leftists to work with centrists, and that's certainly a disaster waiting to happen. Though there is also the third option of the LDP ruling in minority government with their coalition partner Komeito, along with what is called a supply and confidence deal made with either Isshin or the DPP. Now, for our American viewers, to put it simply, very, very simply, the difference is that being part of a coalition obligates a minor party to support the government's agenda no matter what. And a supply and confidence deal shows that the government has the numbers to govern, but the minor party doesn't necessarily have to fully support all the legislation of the government. Editor's note here, so at the time of viewing, Isshin has rejected a coalition with both the LDP and the CDP, which means the Grand Coalition is completely out of the question because the CDP simply does not have the votes to achieve a majority without all of the minor parties working together, and that includes Ishin. Currently, all eyes are on the DPP. Tamaki is currently being courted by both the LDP and CTP, but from the looks of it, my prediction is the most likely outcome will be an LDP-led minority government with the DPP providing supply and confidence, unless, of course, the DPP changes their mind again, which totally wouldn't happen while I'd be editing this video. So, alright, so another editor's note. So, according to Arin Yumi anyway, he's also made predictions in terms of what could happen next. The two most likely outcomes that he's suggested are the LDP minority government, which we've already discussed, or the CDP minority government with Ishin and the DPP providing confidence and supply. However, the second option is probably the least unlikely. I think we've already mentioned it before, but Ishin is basically like a right-wing populist party, so it's very unlikely for them to go with the CDP. And the DPP are also full of like they're not conservative, right? They're not right-wingers, but they're all full of people who left the CDP in the first place because of how liberal it was becoming. So that second option is very, very unlikely to happen. And I do trust Arin Yumi's commentary here as well. So I'm also going to say LDP minority government is probably the most likely. Even though Komeito, that's the thing as well, which is like Komeito could also explode, and the DPP still can't make up its mind at time of writing anyway. So in terms of the consequences for the LDP, Ishiba has to take responsibility for this result, and I don't think he'll last till Christmas unless by some miracle he does. Though while he is a moderate and has historically been anti-Abe and has backtracked and doesn't offer anything really exciting, there is something so quaint about a guy who's just persisted in trying to get the LDP leadership. Mind you, this guy's run in 5 LDP leadership elections beforehand, and he finally got the job. So one can't help but kind of feel sorry for him after this result. In terms of Sanae Takaichi, the actual conservative becoming the next LDP leader, it's going to be difficult for her because the Abe faction was absolutely hammered, but at the same time, it's her bold conservatism that could revitalize the LDP, though again, it's difficult for her considering she's lost a lot of allies. So with that, this was a very consequential election for Japan because in terms of mass immigration and the alphabet cult, if the Grand Coalition is successful, which is still unlikely, but if it was, those issues are at risk of moving Japan towards the disastrous model of governance which we've seen ravaging the West. But I am not a doomer, and if these policies did even manage to go through in the first place, the consequences of such policies could backfire on the centrists and engender voters to turn back to the LDP, which has provided Japan with stable governance for the majority of the time Japan's been a democracy. So with that, if you are interested in anime content, on the other hand, which is the content that I usually do, and its connections with the Christian faith, please do consider watching my last video on wanting to be needed.